If you're not in the line for coffee, please take your seats. Again, I want to express appreciation to our religious leaders, and I hope that this evocation of ritual processes for cleansing and healing are helpful to us as we enter into a conversation about spiritual care in the afterlife of war. Since we come from varied settings to this event, my goal in this brief presentation is to help us have some shared understanding of military moral injury as a kind of foundation for today's conversations. In other words, how do we know or recognize moral injury as when we see it, when we experience it in the lives of persons in communities or other settings where we offer spiritual care? As I proceed, I'll be drawing from portions of the handout on implications for spiritual care that you find in your folders on the left-hand side, which I hoped would be helpful to you. One clarification may be helpful as we explore moral injury today. Surely it will occur to you that moral injury is also a useful concept in other contexts than the military. That is true. Larry Graham helpfully explores this in his book, Moral Injury Healing Wounded Souls, that you may find on the resource sheet. Today, our focus will be on military moral injury. This conference represents a wide range of persons, including some with deeper acquaintance in military moral injury, such as military chaplains and hospital and VA chaplains. And others of us are here because we know our faith communities include persons affected by war and its afterlife with its personal, relational, and generational consequences. Moral injury is a recent term coined by the Veterans Administration to help understand the rise in suicides among veterans in the recent battles, recent wars, now approximating 22 a day, an increase since the onset of these current wars. So it's a new term for an ancient insight, well described in the words of psychiatrist Jonathan Shea. What spills blood wounds spirit. Some of you will remember in the Hebrew Bible, we find in Leviticus, for example, that after battle, men who fought did not return immediately to their homes, but underwent a time of cleansing. We know as well that in early Christian communities, in early centuries, Christian communities also practiced this recognition of the need for men who returned from battle to undergo what was a year of penance before they could take the sacrament again. Somehow, over the millennia, we lost this wisdom about the spiritual consequences of war, that war changes lives forever. Moral injury is well described as a wound of conscience, and as such, it is distinct from post-traumatic stress. PTS is the consequence of terror, of fearing for one's life, often deepened by repeated experiences of such terror. Moral injury and post-traumatic stress may occur together, and when they do, they amplify the pain that each brings to a veteran. You see on the handout two well-regarded and often cited definitions that together help describe the precipitating experiences of moral injury, especially as agential moral injury, that is, the action that we take. With Shea's definition, for example, we could imagine a soldier ordered to shoot at young persons moving toward a vehicle filled with U.S. troops, and their hands seem ready to throw something. Is it a grenade or a rock? Or troops may be ordered not to stop and offer aid to wounded civilians, but to keep moving further to gain ground in an offensive action, when they know failing to assist will mean death to those civilian women and children. With Brett Litz and his colleagues, moral injury may mean, for example, that one does knowingly perpetrate great harm or loss of life to an enemy combatant or civilian in the crossfire of battle. It may mean that one fails to prevent harm to others, including civilians or one's comrades. It may mean a soldier bears witness to the sheer brutality of combat and finds the scope and scale of it calls into question whatever their moral or spiritual framework is about the agency of any divine power or their imagination about the morality of human beings that they had when they entered the military. Finally, as some veterans describe, moral injury may arise as one learns about acts that transgress expectations of human behavior, such as some experienced as they saw images of torture sanctioned by our government at Abu Ghraib. In contrast to agential moral injury, receptive military moral injury helps describe the experience of troops, women and men, who experience moral injury not by their actions, but imposed by the actions of those they trusted as comrades, who are there to protect them, to have their backs, so to speak. Military sexual trauma, for example, occurs in camps or for sailors on board their ship. And sometimes these service women and men find no protection when they dare to report it. Or as Muslim chaplain Sharita Hussain would have described for us today, Muslims in our military may likely find themselves subject to suspicion and ostracization by their own comrades who extend to these Muslim U.S. troops their suspicion of the enemy, whose military action is cloaked by fundamentalist forms of Islam. Whether agential or receptive moral injury, these varied experiences give rise to what Larry Graham described as a loss of innocence that cannot be regained. It can only be mourned. There appear to be factors that make moral injury more pronounced in these current military actions. For example, current combat zones often involve more exposure to civilians, and often combat is close enough to know that one's bullet took a life, including possibly a civilian life, women and children whose bodies you then pass by, and whom you know the enemy sometimes involves in conflict. It is ambiguous and life-threatening. Unlike Vietnam, many U.S. troops now have access to Skype or phone calls home after a day in combat, which provides a kind of jarring contrast, disconnects with the emotional experience of combat. There is also for many the toll of repeated deployments. In the United States, where participation in religious communities is declining, some troops find the brutality of war discloses a thin or unreflective moral or spiritual framework for processing the brutality that human beings do to one another in these current actions. Others may find their moral or religious framework is inadequate for the brutality of war as they experience it, perhaps because they went with such certainty that this kind of brutality would not be allowed either by the divine or that human beings would not do it. So, ironically, certainty proves brittle in the context of this brutality. And their risk is not understood or adequately imagined by citizens who greet them upon their return with a simple thank you for their service, as if war was not, first of all, a national effort in which our military fights. That is, that nations wage war and soldiers fight them. How might we overhear or recognize moral injury in the behavior and comments of congregants affected by combat and their families? What shall we look for as religious leaders and spiritual caregivers respond to congregants and families? I want to share now 3 fictional composites of veterans experiencing military moral injury for our own reflection. Several military chaplains and veterans helped me to shape these vignettes, and I'm very grateful to them. So first of all, let me speak of Russell. Russell is a 23-year-old Army veteran just back from a 1-year tour in Afghanistan. Russell is a child of an African-American Protestant Christian congregation. His father is a Vietnam veteran. His parents own and operate a small business. The entire family has been active in the congregation. Russell received an Eagle Scout Award for the community garden he helped initiate at the church. He received a Rotary Scholarship when he graduated from high school 4 years ago. He wanted a college education, and after 2 years in junior college, he joined the Army to fulfill his desire to serve his country and contribute to peace and to help fund the last 2 years of college. Russell was an infantryman. He fought in several difficult battles that involved civilian casualties to adults and children, as well as the deaths and serious injuries to men in his own unit. He did not seek assistance in reflecting on these experiences while in the Army, nor did he report being troubled by them at his discharge evaluation. Russell returned home 8 months ago. His parents quickly sought out their pastor to express concern for Russell. He had changed in demeanor, isolating himself, anxious, and no longer sure about the next steps in his life. Before he left, he was at the center of family life and energy. Now it is as if he is marginally present to them. When his pastor called him to get together for coffee, he reluctantly agreed. And in the conversation, he shared that he now finds faith in God, a God able to make a difference in the world for good, to be very difficult. He no longer can make sense of the world he saw from the battlefield and bombed out city streets with too many children's bodies borne by bullets. He cannot justify the way he was ordered to act and cannot recognize himself in memories of his own behavior that he knows are true and cannot forget. Russell is using his VA benefits to attend the local college. He shares an apartment with a slightly older veteran from his high school who is now also attending that college. He describes his classmates as immature. He's focusing on his courses to finish as quickly as he can. And he mentions to his mother that he's gone to the college health center to talk with a counselor and is taking medication for depression. He attends church irregularly, but he does come by to chat with the pastor from time to time. And he's considering coming to the group of veterans in the congregation. They're drawn from several local churches that meet regularly. Rachel is married to Jim, who's completing his final tour in Afghanistan as a reservist and should be home in 2 months. Rachel and Jim identify as European Americans and participate in a dominant culture Christian Protestant congregation. They are the parents of 2 preschool children, a 2-year-old daughter, Lydia, and a 5-year-old son, Jimmy. Rachel was attracted to Jim's strength and self-confidence in his ability to accomplish his goals and to protect and provide for his family. They married after he completed his service as an enlisted man and had begun his work at an insurance agency. They had not expected his reserve work to result in a tour of duty, but they do rely on the additional income to support their family. While Jim has been in Afghanistan, Rachel has sometimes called on a care team at the congregation to help with the stressors of parenting 2 preschool children with no grandparents or other family nearby. Rachel has stayed in touch with her pastors at the United Methodist congregation from time to time about communication with Jim. A few weeks ago, she called to report that his calls to her have changed in sobering ways. He was recently reassigned from a non-combat assignment to one that involved participating in patrols for neighborhoods where there has been occasional violence and tense moments when he and others were ordered to detain civilians for questioning. Now his calls home have been markedly different. He called distressed about the crossfire deaths of children who reminded him of their own children and the unnerving way he was ordered to treat civilians detained when on patrol because they were suspected of causing violence. In tears over the phone, he asked Rachel if she could still love him and trust him with their children. He said he was struggling to make any sense of the moral world that had once seemed so orderly to him. He haltingly voiced his fear that he had betrayed who he had understood himself to be as a good and decent person. So Rachel asked her pastor now, how can she help her husband with his grief and discomfort? How can she comfort him? And meanwhile, she also worries out loud about who he is becoming. What will happen when he comes home in 2 months? He is clearly not the self-confidence, in-control guy whose only tears had been at the birth of their children. She is anxious about how to support him when he returns. And she's spoken with a few spouses of veterans and reservists in the congregation who have warned her that entry to family life from battle can be very difficult. Frank is a veteran of the Korean War. He was born in 1932 and entered the Korean War as it began in 1950 at the age of 18. He is now in an assisted living setting with his spouse, and his health is declining. Hospice care is not far away. In the last months, Frank has begun to discuss for the first time with his rabbi regarding his sense of deep grief and remorse about his experiences in battle, in combat during the war. He described participating in combat in 1950 through 1952 when he was a teenager. He mentioned scenes of violence against civilians and hand-to-hand combat with enemy forces that have haunted him for 60 years. He despairs of ever experiencing peace and forgiveness for some of his actions in these combat situations. Frank's wife also struggles with how to accompany her spouse in his suffering from memories of this previously undisclosed trauma. Their adult children are stunned by their father's reflections. Frank asked the rabbi to come, and over a series of weeks, he and the rabbi reflect on the prayers from Yom Kippur, especially the last evening service and the Vidui, the prayer prayed before death. They draw on these prayers to deepen Frank's assurance of God's mercy, and together they wonder about the ways Frank might take action that will fulfill his obligation as a Jew to enact his repentance for those he killed or harmed in battle. These brief vignettes, of course, are part of much richer journeys with religious leaders and family and friends to reweave an identity that will sustain these veterans and the relationships to which they return from war. Missing among these vignettes of veterans is the recognition that moral injury also affects those who were near the combat zone and its aftermath, nurses and doctors, those staffing the morgues, those who offer rehab and mental health back in the United States when soldiers return home. Moral injury is not only world-shattering for combat veterans. War changes all who come within its orbit. What are we likely to hear as veterans like those described in these vignettes and those who support them in battle describe the effects of living with moral injury? Certainly, we will hear, maybe not in theological language, about the spiritual losses and pain, as Russell and Jim both articulate, Russell in particular, but we might use the term desacralization of life. That is, the denial of what they had understood as the sacred nature of each life created in God's image. So a loss of the meaning system that their faith provided. For some, that will be because through the absence of a participation or a very minimal participation in any form of religious tradition, they found themselves unaware that they were entering something that would call upon some system of meaning to sustain them. So they are at sea now with no resources for going forward. Or perhaps, as Russell, the frames of meaning were too clear, too simple, and broke brittly in the face of the destruction, the desecrating violence that they experienced. Perhaps they go with, sort of minimal and not very developed religious experiences. I'm sure some Christians do that. I won't speak for other traditions. And so they really just have minimal reflection about the ritual resources and the power of the sacred texts of their tradition. So a very thin foundation by which to draw on those resources in such a terrifying time. So many find a radical challenge to spiritual frameworks and find themselves confronting the tragic and an unraveling moral universe that held them once before. As Michael Yandel said in a 2015 article in the Christian Century, war lays flat the moral walls, the moral constructs that they went to war presuming to be true. There are deep questions then about whether hope in a moral universe where love is real and powerful is justified. And what sort of God or divine would allow such brutality and inhuman treatment that includes children, women, and other innocent civilians? How to pray in the wake of seeing such sheer brutality? There is isolating shame and guilt and a sense of unforgivableness. How to imagine that God's love, if there is such a God, is strong enough to reach across the isolating shame and guilt for those returning from war with a shattered sense of themselves as good and moral persons. Is forgiveness possible? Can their families and their congregation, their rabbi, imam, or pastor trust and love them if they knew? They cannot seek the forgiveness of those they harmed or saw blown apart. How to live with that? How can they be restored to the human community as a child of God? What repentance could ever be adequate for such evil? Michael Yandel, who will speak in a moment, said in that 2015 article, "What began to erode for me in Iraq in 2004 was my perception of good and evil. What I lost was a world that makes moral sense." For Yandel and other veterans, they also described the loss of themselves, a sense of themselves as reliably ethical people. So the whole moral framework with which they might have gone confidently to the battlefield is stressed, to say the least. And for some, there will be, upon arrival and as they stay and go back for other deployments, a recognition that even the national rationale for this war seems to shift. Is it about freedom? Is it about oil and the income that we get from it? For some, there are the experiences of betrayal from fellow soldiers or sailors as military sexual violence. And for others, such as Muslim veterans, the tolerance of anti-Muslim rhetoric in the forces suggests the country for whom they risk their lives does not value theirs. The other thing that Frank's story reminds us of, and that Jim worried about with his son Jimmy, has to do with the lifelong and generational character of moral injury. Moral injury is more likely than not, for those involved in war, historically shaped by the particular time and history in which it occurred. So Frank's experience of war in Korea is not the same as Vietnam veterans or for Russell or Jim in the current battles. And the national story into which veterans return and has inculcated the identity of each soldier in a particular way. It's hard to talk about moral injury when you come back from the Great War, for example. In the movie Almost Sunrise, 2 Afghanistan veterans more than 5 years later and other veterans of earlier conflicts describe the struggle too shameful to articulate, except perhaps to other veterans who know the same context. And there is, as Frank described, anguish at the end of life, the fear of unforgivable status. War reshapes families and individual family members across generations. In 2012, when Dr. Brock had just begun to introduce some of us in theological education to this concept of moral injury, I happened to be at a conference where I was with military chaplains, and I was talking to them about this concept which they had not heard, and several of them happened to have fathers who fought in Vietnam. And to the man, they said, "Oh, that explains my dad." Spouses who experience the ambiguous loss and great anxiety about the future, like we heard in Rachel's voice, are a part of the consequence of moral injury. And spouses and children must find their way in accompanying someone altered by deployment, who finds it difficult to embrace them in the same way and is fearful of what they might discover about them. Moral injury is embodied. It alters the way we experience our own bodies, the anxieties that our bodies carry. Shame hurts. Guilt hurts. It haunts us. And we can also use the term disenfranchised grief. That is, it is a grief that others do not recognize. They thank you for your service. They don't want to hear the rest of the story. Missing, then, is the recognition that civilians, like many of us, are also at least complicit in the wounds of war. Captain Beth Stallinga, military chaplain in the United States Navy, who has a terrific article that's mentioned in the resources sheet, wrote, "Our faith communities are in need of rites and rituals which openly acknowledge the corporate reality and accountability of war. In a democracy, because a warrior is deployed at the bequest of leaders elected by the populace, an entire country goes to war. Currently, most congregants are unreflective about the implications of war for us as civilians. Military moral injury wounds the hearts and consciences of veterans and changes their lives and the lives of those who love them forever." I hope this brief review helps you get a sense of how moral injury appears in the lives of veterans and their families. As we know, spiritual care begins with lived experience. We walk beside those who are much more like us than not. We listen, bearing witness to their world-shattering pain. We support them in finding the courage to speak the unspeakable and find a way to reimagine life that is once again shaped by purpose and love. When we do, our lives are also changed. War changes lives forever. But it need not be the last word. Bearing witness to the toll of war and supporting the courage to rebuild a life after war will also change our lives. We will turn now to hear from Michael Yandel, a veteran, who will reflect on his experience of moral injury and how it shapes his life. And then we'll hear from Dr. Shelley Rambo as a theologian, and from me, yet again, as a pastoral theologian, and we'll be responding in an effort to further explore the implications of spiritual care for those experiencing military moral injury. So in this moment of transition, and after each of the three of us speak, we want to invite you to jot some notes, ideas that have come to you, or questions that you might want to share with the group following the break, when we'll be engaged in general conversation and discussion among each other. Okay? Thank you very much.
There we go. I'm deeply honored to be on this panel and with you all this morning, and I'm just going to get right to it. Okay. I was an enlisted soldier in the U.S. Army from 2002 to 2006. I was an explosive ordnance disposal specialist, and I deployed to Iraq in 2004 as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom 2. I self-identify as morally injured, and my remarks here are aimed at describing what exactly that self-identification means to me. Paul Tillich described the anxiety of our era in the form of a question. How do I find meaning in a meaningless world? And this question articulates well, for me, what it is to live with moral injury. And for me, it all starts with why I joined the Army in the first place. I would like to say it was all about virtues like courage and selfless service, and maybe those virtues were a part of it, but I also wanted to get out of my world. I grew up in a meaningful world. I grew up in a small town in West Tennessee. Hard work was highly valued. All the roads were well known, familiar. And life's most difficult questions had straightforward and trustworthy answers. This was a meaningful world in which I grew up. But it also felt to me, at the same time, like a stiflingly small world. And I felt small in it. In his novel of the Iraq War, The Yellow Birds, Kevin Powers describes this smallness through the eyes of the main character, an enlisted soldier who is now at his unit preparing to go to war. And I quote, "Being from a place where a few facts are enough to define you, where a few habits can fill a life, causes a unique kind of shame. We'd had small lives, populated by a longing for something more substantial than dirt roads and small dreams. So we'd come here, where life needed no elaboration and others would tell us who to be." End quote. The Army felt like something more substantial to me, a way out of my small world. But the smallness of my world also limited the way I thought about leaders and authorities. I associated power and authority with virtue. I joined the Army to get out, and I trusted that the people who would be telling me who to be would be shaping me to do something good, to be good. I wanted out. I wanted to do good. I wanted to be good. But I didn't want small town, small world goodness. I wanted goodness with meat on its bones, goodness with power. And that's what the Army and the nation represented to me as I left home in 2002. Now, war did not destroy my hometown or the world in which I grew up. I've described moral injury as revealing to me something about who I am. I've said that it revealed to me that I'm not who I thought I was. But that's not quite the whole story, because in a way, war also revealed to me that I was, in fact, who I always feared I was. I was a small person from a small world. The world once meaningful was rendered meaningless to me by war. How so? Paul Tillich described the anxiety of meaninglessness as, quote, "anxiety about the loss of an ultimate concern, of a meaning which gives meaning to all meanings. The anxiety is aroused by the loss of a spiritual center, of an answer, however symbolic and indirect, to the question of the meaning of existence." End quote. C.J. Chivers, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, in my reading of him, provides a specific application of this anxiety of meaninglessness in his new book called The Fighters. He says, quote, "Veterans of recent American wars confront something pernicious but usually invisible: the difficulties of trying to square their feelings of commitment after the terrorist attacks in 2001 with the knowledge that their lives were harnessed to wars that ran far past the pursuit of justice and ultimately did not succeed." End quote. The feelings of commitment, of wanting to do good and to be good, that commitment was meaningful. It was an answer, however symbolic and indirect, to the question of the meaning of existence. And that commitment is still meaningful. For me, moral injury is the abyss between that meaningful commitment and the reality of war. I mentioned that the home I left was one in which questions had trustworthy answers. The concepts of right and wrong in my youth existed in sharp contrast. Their contours were easy to see, easy to define. And joining the Army and going to war simply felt like the right thing to do because someone had done something wrong. By joining the Army, I could add power to my goodness. I could do the right thing on a larger scale than I could in a small town in West Tennessee. That's how it seemed to me. But war, as I experienced it, is not a world of such sharp contrast and straightforward answers. It is a twilight world. And I first started to recognize it on the streets of Baghdad, because no amount of hard work, training, or trustworthy and principled answers to difficult questions prepared me for the concrete reality of those streets in 2004. And the wars of the 21st century are very different than the wars of the past. There are no longer clashes between large uniformed armies on a battlefield. These wars are asymmetric in nature. One force, in this case the invading and occupying force of the U.S. military, is disproportionately powerful in terms of personnel, technology, and training to the extreme. By the time I arrived in Iraq in 2004, relatively early in the war's timeline, though victory had already been declared, there was no opposing army. There was only a vaguely defined enemy called the insurgency. During my time in Iraq, I never encountered a single person that I could, with certainty, identify as an insurgent. The majority of people I saw and with whom I interacted were children and families, civilians whose lives had already been drastically changed by this war, still in its infancy. I was a 19-year-old driving through city streets with body armor, a rifle equipped with a grenade launcher, and a truck full of equipment. The people I encountered were families trying to live their lives. I embodied the asymmetric distribution of power. All I ever saw of the insurgency were the roadside bombs they left for us. The ever elusive insurgent was and remains faceless to me. This is not to say she never existed, but her facelessness renders my commitment, my actions, and my service meaningless. I joined to fight an enemy who had done wrong. For the sake of pursuit of this enemy insurgent who remained faceless for me, I started to ignore things that would not have been acceptable to me in other circumstances. Certainly not in my small town world, where non-combatants were pulled from their homes in the middle of the night with black bags tied over their heads, where people were dragged to a prison compound and kept with no avenue for recourse or appeal, no law of any kind determining how long they could be kept or for what reason. As for me, I began to see all civilians as potential insurgents. And this is the move from moral certainty to moral twilight. I wanted to do good, to be good. In my small hometown world, that meant treating human beings with dignity and respect. In war, where I was given so much power, I saw human beings as insurgents. I was smaller there than I had ever been. War is the third party that's difficult to see because it's so pervasive, consuming all our commitments and meanings and purposes and powers. It takes our breath away. Again, Kevin Powers in his novel poetically captures this character of war. And I quote, "The fact is, we were not destined at all. The war would take what it could get. It was patient. It didn't care about objectives or boundaries, whether you were loved by many or not at all. While I slept that summer, the war came to me in my dreams and showed me its sole purpose, to go on, only to go on. And I knew the war would have its way. You're nothing. That's the secret. A uniform in a sea of numbers, a number in a sea of dust. End quote. The civilians, the insurgents, myself, we're all powerless and small in the face of war. And in that powerlessness, real human beings have been treated without dignity, without respect. And the shame for that mistreatment falls on us all. Because somewhere, sometime before the war, we had to start stripping away dignity and respect in order to go to war. This war injures us all, morally and spiritually. And I'm not trying to pass the buck here. There are things I did of which I am ashamed. And there are things I did of which I am surprised to still discover I am proud. But the war goes beyond me. I've said elsewhere, I've never waged a war, but I've fought in one. My actions in war belong to me, and I must wrestle with their meaning. But to whom does the war itself belong? So I recently went back to my small hometown in West Tennessee to give a talk on war and moral injury. I don't think they knew what I was going to talk about when they invited me. After I spoke, a former Army Ranger came up and told me how he has thought about these issues in the past, how he's gotten through them. And I paraphrase. He said, I tell soldiers, you have a job to do, you have to do it. You've got to leave the rest for God to sort out. I can appreciate the idea here that war comes with constraints. We don't have time in high-stakes situations to deliberate the meaning of existence. But there seems to be an infinite time afterward. And the simple truth is, God did not start this war. We did. And we must do the sorting if we are to find meaning in a world that we have rendered meaningless. And I'll just close with one more quote from Kevin Powers. What is created in this world or made can be undone, unmade. The threads of a rope can be unwoven. And if that rope is needed as a guideline for a ferry to a farther shore, then one must invent a way to weave it back, or there will be drownings in the streams that cross our paths. I accept now, though it took some time, that must be its own permission. End quote.
Please take just a few minutes to make whatever notes or questions you might have later for Michael or others.
Good morning. I'm very humbled to follow Michael's story and to bear witness to it in this group. I'm also very honored to have had the opportunity to follow multiple invitations of military chaplains who were students at Boston University School of Theology. And my invitation into moral injury is just that. I followed invitations from the students that I taught that ended up teaching me, that landed me in places like the chaplaincy schools at Fort Jackson and San Antonio Air Force Base. And I kept telling these chaplains that the only thing that qualified me to be in the room was the fact that my last name is Rambo, which just has to be named in every military setting. So in that spirit, how does the ancient wars story speak to the contemporary one? The wars, this was psychiatrist Jonathan Shea's question in Achilles in Vietnam. Bringing Greek epics to bear on modern war experiences, Shea felt that something significant happened when he linked the warrior experiences to the contemporary experiences of veterans returning from combat. It provided a frame to interpret their hurt beyond the confines of a medical model. It also awakened the conscience of a collective to the society responsible for acts performed and received in combat. Odysseus and Achilles are ancient warriors, but their stories resonate with universal themes of loss, shame, betrayal, and guilt. These stories reach across time to touch wounds in the present day. I share with Jonathan Shea a belief in the resonance between old stories and new ones. For those of us who live our lives deeply influenced by sacred texts, this move to read the new in creative tension with the old is very familiar to us. Call it tradition. Call it the exercise of preaching. Call it midrash. Interpreting sacred texts attuned to the dynamics of trauma and moral injury position us to hear, in the words of theologian Rebecca Chopp, a moral summons coming from these texts. Can we witness them for the truths that they tell? As a theologian working within the Christian tradition, the texts that speak to the experience of life arising from death, resurrection accounts, are particularly important to examine given the challenge of veterans to reconfigure what it means to live and live beyond a death. Resurrection speaks truths about life on the other side of death. For veterans facing everyday challenges of coming to life again, what is the meaning of resurrection for the wounds that do not simply go away? This ancient depiction of the relationship between death and life is often narrated too smoothly, as if the emergence of life from death is easy and expected, promised, and thus ensured. When mapped onto the messy experiences of veterans coming to terms with life fundamentally reshaped by war, this wound story may fail to speak. Biblical scholars and theologians working in the area of trauma emphasize that the dynamics of cross and resurrection, based on what we know about trauma, may speak into this messiness. They attest to the experiences of an ancient community struggling to make sense of a violent death as an orienting feature of their lives moving forward. The chief challenge and hermeneutical insight that it brings is this: wounds do not simply go away. Wounds appear in the sphere of life. And because of this, the meaning of resurrection is opened up, brought into the contemporary situations of persons struggling to make sense of the reality of wounds that do not simply close up, of the strange timeline of suffering that moral injury and trauma follow. There is a mark that remains long after an event of suffering is over. Those of us who attempt to give expression to moral injury within the religious sphere are looking within our traditions for what they say about this imprint of the past on the present. If veterans carry the weight of the past within them, what healing balm is there within our traditions to tend the wounds rather than look away from them or simply claim victory over them? In 2012, let's see if this works, yeah. In 2012, I was invited into a veteran healing circle. There I witnessed what I call a resurrection story. Warrior's Journey Home developed through the vision of Minister Reverend John Schloop and expanded into a model of veteran healing that draws deeply upon Native healing traditions. Like Shea, the ancient themes resonate in the present. They recognize the responsibility of the wider community in bringing veterans back home. They witness the messiness of war and its ongoing impact on the lives of those veterans in their community, largely located in the Miami Valley of Ohio. It takes persons of strong heart, John Schloop says, to accompany those who journey to and home from war. The community provides a holding space, a context of witnessing in which veterans can come to life again. The journey home is neither smooth nor linear. It's not an individual's work alone. The group believes it's the work of a collective. I simply can't do justice to the many dimensions of this model of veteran healing or to kind of call into question some of its practices. But it reshaped how I read the upper room account in the Gospel of John in the Christian scriptures. The theological reading that I offer is both familiar and not. It follows a recognizable arc of the biblical text, and yet if we bring this ancient story into the veteran healing context, some things begin to shift. I'm providing you with a visual guide, perhaps the most recognizable one in art history, the painting by Caravaggio. When placed within the healing circle of Warrior's Journey Home, it no longer supports the story of doubting Thomas, a story that is centered around Thomas's failure to believe in Jesus as the resurrected Christ. Thomas's great proclamation, "My Lord and my God," has been the truth statement, capital T, that puts the exclamation mark on a Christian story about belief overcoming doubt, faith triumphing over skepticism. My concern is that although wounds are at the center of this story, if we had the shadow right, you can see the wounds are right at eye level. My concern is that while wounds are at the center of this story, the meaning of the story can rise above wounds or, as I fear, even fail to see them. In the Gospel of John, the disciples have a series of encounters with the resurrected Jesus. This gospel, distinct from the others, features wounds and multiple showings of the wounds to the disciples. Here we meet the disciples huddled in a room, unsure of where to go and whether there is life ahead. We know from the text that the door is locked, and I imagine the air is stale. There, in this gospel, a clear enemy is named, perhaps secured in the disciples' hearts, but it's clear that that fear has a grip on this community. In this context, Jesus appears. The dead returns to life. And he appears to the disciples in both spectral and fleshy form. He moves through walls, seemingly immaterial, and yet exposes his wounds, marking his carnality or materiality. He appears to teach the disciples again, but this time his teachings focus on wounds. The teachings are startlingly somatic. See and touch the wounds, he tells them. Extending himself to them, he challenges them to see working first at the level of their perceptions. Can you see what is right in front of you? At the same time, its haunting quality refuses their grasp. They will not recognize him easily. He provides a nexus for witnessing to the marks of harm, often invisible to others, that lie beneath the surface of life. The encounters challenge the disciples to see differently under conditions in which visibility is questioned and questionable. The work of witnessing invisible wounds requires a reorientation of the senses. Sight, sound, and touch are all in play in this upper room sequence. The fact that Jesus orients them to life through orienting them to seeing and touching wounds is significant. The upper room becomes a container, I think, for wound work. And the Warrior's Journey Home Circle is a present-day site for this work. Gail, one of the members, shows up every week for the circle. Her brother, Bud, was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. He was a very quiet man, she told me, but even more so after Vietnam. For decades, he was in and out of rehab hospitals. He held down a job, but he could not maintain connections with his wife and daughter. He agreed to come with Gail to a meeting of Warrior's Journey Home. The members of Warrior's Journey Home gather in a circle week after week, unsure of the shape of life ahead. They hold space for difficult, if not impossible, truths to be told. It's a ritual space. As you see, the cross hangs over the basketball net in the church gym. The white sage burns slowly in the center. Dog tags hanging on the walking sticks, hand-carved by a member of the group. The circle process requires those present to first engage in a clearing round as a way of preparing for the work of receiving the stories of war. This clearing takes place by making eye contact with each member of the circle. When the talking stick comes to you, you hold it, and before you speak your name, you take each person in the circle into account, eyes moving clockwise around the circle as the stick is passed. When it returns, you grasp it and state your name. I am Shelley, and I am clear. The collective surveying of the eyes is preparation for a collective journey. Listen, speak, and heal is the motto and mission of the group. In some circles, on some weeks, little and perhaps nothing is spoken. In that clearing, a person, by declaring themselves clear, enters into a different sphere of seeing. This, I think, is what the gospel text hints at as Jesus reapproaches the disciples as if they did not really see the wounds in the first encounter. Instead, the challenge of seeing pervades this passage. How do you see a figure who moves through walls? When the text says that they see his wounds and celebrate, why does Jesus approach them again, organizing them around the wounds, not once, but 3 times? For those in Warrior's Journey Home, the eyes are like portals to a soul wound, and the clearing is necessary to make way for soul work. And let's imagine they're the soul injured, cut by the razors of war that enter into veterans when acts either perpetuated or witnessed cut at the core of who they were. These razors live within them, residing for years, even decades. Bud, Gail tells me, came back from war, but he never came home. He pulled away from everyone. In the clearing round, the group clears the passage for the razors of war to be released. Cheyenne Eagleheart, the co-facilitator of the group, used the image of razors and doves to describe her healing work. It's the work of releasing the razors that lie deep within. While razors cut upon entrance, they also cut when they exit. The release is painful too. It's part of the painful process of rebirth. Like a midwife, a healer calls out the razors as if they move through the channel cleared by the community. These are Cheyenne's words. I had the razors come out of me. When I had to do my healing, I had to go back to the places where I was shattered and that I died. I died there. And so you're asking me to return to the place that I died. The lines blur as Cheyenne speaks about razors and doves. It's unclear as Cheyenne talks to me whether she's talking about her own experience of wounding or her experience of being a healer. In the Warrior's Journey Home work, the wounds often cross. This doesn't erase the suffering of an individual. Instead, there's a communing of wounds that also becomes a site of wounds resurrecting, as if a needle and thread is stitching a collective wound. When the razors break the surface, Cheyenne says, they become doves. The figure of the resurrecting Jesus becomes a site of wounds crossing. He breathes spirit into the room. These images are rich. These religious images provide, I think, a poetics of healing. As terms like moral injury get placed within a clinical framework, I worry about what is lost if we abandon the metaphorical and imaginative language that is fundamental to our spiritual and religious traditions. The imprecision of terms that encircle moral injury frameworks, language such as soul loss, may be clinically frustrating, but they are coffers, I think, of spiritual resilience. They story existence through images that resonate across time. Religious traditions speak about a fundamental connectedness, dark nights of struggle, about a spirit surveying the reaches of the soul to bring back what is lost, of a God who celebrates when the lost things are found, of communities of saints and ancestors that presence the past. And here in this scene, as Jesus, the figure whose body holds the pain of the universe, and through the summoning of a community of witnesses, this body offers a channel for doves to be released. The poetics of soul work. Amidst the moves to define moral injury within a clinical framework, it's important not to lose the work of storying. The rich language and images that religious traditions use to speak about harm and healing cannot simply be treated as an accessory to clinical definitions. In a world of the empirical and measurable, this power of sacred storying can be lost. Theologians are forging amazing work on moral injury. Michael, Zachary, many in this room. They're forging work on moral injury from political, ethical, and liturgical angles. And I want to add poetics to this. Maybe we can call it poetic or prophetic poetics to the dimension of moral injury. The prophets of our traditions were also poets who provided visions not just of the world as it is, but visions of what it could be. Thank you.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, even briefly, to respond now as a pastoral theologian to the experience that Michael has shared with such honesty and power. As I said at the close of my previous comments, spiritual care begins with lived experience, tending to wounds as we are trusted to see and feel them. It seeks to join resources of faith, traditions, and spiritual practices with the pain of those with whom we walk as caregivers. Michael Yandel helped to describe for us the life-changing, world-shattering consequences of war. He references psychological, moral, spiritual, embodied, and existential losses of moral injury that are now woven into the fabric of his life. Pastoral theologians seem to have found two interrelated themes especially helpful for sharing our care with those who experience military moral injury: loss and grief, especially ambiguous loss, and lamentation. Lamentation reminds us that military moral injury arises from the world-shattering experience that war is. As Dr. Larry Graham put it in his book, Moral Injury, Healing Wounded Souls, innocence lost is innocence mourned, not innocence regained. Those who feel the brunt of war come home affected by shame, guilt for actions taken, guilt for surviving when others did not, and reeling from the loss of whatever spiritual and moral frames had once provided a sense of structure and meaning. What is especially complicating is that the losses war creates are often silencing. Who can dare to speak of war and its consequences for those who came close to its destructive power? The sheer brutality of war provokes a deep spiritual and existential challenge. Predictably, practices of care involve supporting survivors of moral injury in their journey to resolve or more likely diminish feelings such as shame and guilt, betrayal, and anger, so that in time they can construct a new sense of integrity. But as Emmanuel Levinas suggested in his essay, Useless Suffering, the evil of suffering lies in the way it renders those who suffer impotent, feeling abandoned and isolated. Arthur Frank, a medical sociologist who studies embodied suffering, draws on Levinas's observation to suggest that such profound suffering disrupts a person's narrative structure, disrupting their very sense of self. Moral injury with its spiritual and moral and emotional losses reflects what Arthur Frank calls narrative wreckage. The loss of an orienting sense of self as a good person acting in an orderly world. The depth of the suffering is silencing and isolating. This isolating character of devastating suffering is not unlike what we find in the laments that characterize so much of the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. And for those of us who seek to offer spiritual care, we find a clue in these laments. Levinas observes that when those whom suffering renders mute experience a witness who recognizes their suffering and who will walk beside them, the sufferer's voice returns, and hope begins to take root again. In her commentary on the Book of Lamentations, Kathleen O'Connor poses an important caution for us who seek to be such witnesses. Such witness is only effective when it does not reduce or explain away the pain. He calls this a theology of witness. We who seek to be effective witnesses will need to acknowledge we share a common vulnerability. Validating another's suffering discloses not only the sacred quality of their human suffering, it offers a window onto our own. Together, we weep for a wounded world, and together we may resist the oppressive sources of such pain. In speaking of moral injury, Larry Graham said of lamentation that the courage to sustain lamentation is the best hope for reclaiming lives from war. For Graham, lamentation is a means of living as well as possible in spite of what is forever lost. and using what remains to rebuild a life worth having, a way of enduring anguish and becoming strong in the aftermath of adversity. Spiritual care offers us an opportunity to support this recovery of strength and courage through voicing pain. Ironically, lamentation helps create a new narrative from the wreckage war made, and the new narrative will include interrogating the causes of one's suffering in order to endure its aftermath and reinvest in hope. Sustaining that process of lamentation often relies on a witness who walks beside to affirm the importance of voicing that pain, acknowledging guilt, and also recognizing when one's pain belongs to the wreckage that war creates. Spiritual care in the context of moral injury seeks to honor the anguish wrought by war and voiced in lamentation by bearing witness. We have the privilege to walk beside and nurture into speech the voices of those whose war's horror has muted and who need the blessing of hope tested by the worst that human beings can do to one another. Lamentation, as a pathway to hope, points to the value of imagining moral injury through the frame of grief and loss, but a particular sort of grief and loss that Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. In the context of moral injury, she's describing the experience of physically returning from war, yet one's ability to be psychologically present with oneself and relationally is powerfully altered. Perhaps this is how grief looks when we mourn innocence lost that cannot be regained. Boss formulated her theory of ambiguous loss, recognizing that such loss places stress on family and relational systems as well as individuals. And as surely for veterans returning from war bearing the burden of war's wreckage, the capacity to be psychologically present with loved ones is difficult. Ambiguous loss points us toward strategies that help veterans and their families develop resilience. By resilience, Boss means an ability to come to terms with the limits of our human capacities, to master or control outcomes, and to practice more modesty in realizing opportunities for hope and meaning and love that are available to us. Freedom may be limited, but it is real. And she encourages developing practices that take responsibility for one's behaviors where warranted, and externalizing shame and blame when those emotions come from taking responsibility for what we could not have controlled. In the context of moral injury, this may mean spiritual care involves listening for ways to help veterans sort out where guilt for their actions is real and where their actions are shaped by the realities of war itself that were beyond their control. In the context of moral injury, her theory reminds us that when veterans have a better gauge of what is really their responsibility, they can let go of bearing the crushing burden of war on their own. Boss suggests that meaning and belief systems will be important for sustaining hope beyond the limits of what we can control. In the context of moral injury, her theory suggests that resilience will emerge when veterans can reconstruct a hopeful posture based on recognizing that even in the ambiguities of historical life, they can exercise their agency in life-giving ways. Zachary Moon, who leads a workshop later today, has helpfully described the importance of honoring the skills and contributions of veterans, even as we also accompany them in loosening the constraints of moral injury. Boss also encourages employing ritual practices that offer veterans individual and communal opportunities for reasserting personal and communal trust in a social and cosmic order that is stronger than the destructive powers of war. Because ritual practices are performative, asserting the ritual reality as available and true personally and communally, she is right to note how such practices can help renew a sense of connection with a community and with a religious world that is sustaining. There are ample ritual practices in the faiths represented here that foster forgiveness, hope, and healing, including the practice of lament, as we noted earlier. Finally, I want to return to a theme that Michael Yandel mentioned this morning and that military chaplains such as Beth Stallinga note. Military moral injury extends beyond the experience of those who fight in the nation's wars. It belongs to all citizens of nations that wage war. This is an aspect of spiritual care that is emerging, especially if we can draw on the insights from practices of lament in sacred texts and the role of those whose witness makes recovery of the ability to voice anguish possible. It relates to Kathleen O'Connor's comment about a theology of witness through which we recognize our own vulnerability. As her work with Lamentations suggests so poignantly, together we weep for a wounded world, and together we may resist the oppressive sources of such pain. With Larry Graham, I believe we do well to develop ritual practices that help faith communities stand beside those who fought on behalf of our country. We need to confess with them the guilt that is ours to bear and to experience the freedom we have to resist any simple rationale for engaging in war when other recourse is possible. There's a story familiar to many here, beyond those who know it in Hebrew and Christian Bibles, from Genesis 32. It seems to capture the possibilities of wrestling with moral injury and emerging with hope. Arthur Frank invites us to consider Jacob's wrestling as his struggle with moral injury that he incurred in a series of betrayals that began with his birth family, though we cannot be certain what is being contested that night at the Jabbok River, with his brother Esau and many thousands waiting on the other side. The story suggests that Jacob is wrestling with God in a process of coming to terms with his very sense of self, as he confronts the shame and guilt that shape his reflections on his betrayals of relational obligations. Frank poses an important question for those who seek to offer spiritual care. Is Jacob wrestling a blessing out of the angel, or is the angel wrestling the petition for a blessing out of Jacob? Perhaps both are true. It is certainly the case that the wrestling experience sanctifies that place for Jacob, so that he calls it Peniel, meaning the face of God. Spiritual care also presumes God is present in our struggles to wrest meaning and hope from suffering, and blesses such struggles. The struggle was itself wounding for Jacob, and he walked thereafter with a limp. But also as a new man, Israel, he began a future rich with possibilities for meaning and service. Frank offers a theological insight. Sanctification is a recursive process. To be is to wrestle with God. Indeed, it is difficult to imagine being an effective companion in journeying toward healing if we, spiritual caregivers, fail to recognize the strength that comes to those who recover a powerful sense of self as they refuse the bonds of silence and give voice to their suffering. Thank you. Please just take a few minutes and then I'll invite us to a break. Or better yet, take the minutes you need and then enjoy the break. There's food in the hall and coffee over there. I know the limits of my power here.
I heard people typing and writing. Yeah, for everybody.
It's Sean Thompson. Okay, so I'm so.
Where this guy over there kind of nodding?
Okay. Well, I'm so glad, and I thank you so much for this work. Your work is very, very thought-provoking.
Would your grandparents have
Again,
to be
want to apologize if I've been doing anything inadvertently that has.
My dad is John.
I knew Miss Jack.
Yeah, that's what everybody calls
But
it.
I didn't know because I was a little boy.
Sure.
I knew your Uncle Al a lot better. I was thinking you were Jack.
I would love to.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
thank you
Enjoy your
for
little break.
Thank you for who you are.
Okay, well now, yeah.
If you ever have time to talk with your grandparents,
He died when I was about 2 years old, but I've heard things. In fact, I think Rita, did you meet Rita
I know.
like maybe a year ago?
Well,
She emailed me and she had spoken to you, and you had mentioned was your father?
my dad was your dad was pastor.
There you go. See? Okay.
That's pretty cool there.
Yeah, they were there.
And we were over there at their house. They played bridge together.
Wow.
But I said, I wanted, glad that you'd be here.
No. I don't have the right to step in at all. I just wanted to thank
I'll be here all day.
Michael for sharing. That was very, very. It was really. I mean, I think you're really touching on some stuff that. I think that there's a lot of this issue. I think it is deeply affecting. It has a ripple effect throughout our contemporary society. I think that we haven't really gotten around to the beginning to really deal with.
We're not fans of reflecting on the past. So yeah, I leave a lot not dealt with.
I think society itself was rather
Yeah.
Yeah.
the moral guilt that our society.
Well, I think that's, yeah, I mean, the shared responsibility that we clearly are. As you mentioned, we are all, I mean, we are literally everyone. And nobody, let me back. I don't so much feel mainstream.
Let me step around.
In the beginning.
But they still read it as a moral.
We read it that people
Well, they understood that what was being, so the context of them writing of those ancient habits was they were often informed from military instructions, right? The leaders of government and society. So as they were informed, there was something implied in the performance of them that recognized that a collective was involved. Both the military authorities were doing something of these slaves acted out. And those who went to war and were coming back also interpreted something of their experience through those plays. So what was the playwright?
There's down a lot of your
Right?
heroes, a
What were
lot of
those
your
ancient
ideals.
people doing? And some folks will say they were doing moral injury. Right? That they were, so it's a reading of like what we do in clinical settings, in ancient settings, the playwrights and the performances, they were a kind of moral framework for taking care of wounds of war and bringing them back.
Write down your names. So,
See, because the number is so limited, where I'm about to chicken out. You don't think it was building out and making strong orders.
Well, it's interesting. So take Socrates as Ajax, one of the most likened to Ajax. Is a wounded warrior that comes home, and he commits suicide. He's driven to kill hundreds of people out of the kind of madness after the war, comes back and commits suicide. So people are using this ancient play to say, what does it mean that was performed? In the audiences of like ancient
trying to get to the heart of it.
and some are making the case that it was calling military officials and say, look what happens when you order people to go to war. You're also responsible for the madness of war when they were. So it's a reading of the ancient epics that
I hate to interrupt you in the midst of good conversations, but I need to tell you something about parking. So if you're someone who came later rather than sooner, if you are parked in the A lot or in the C lot, which would be the closest lot of parking lots, I lot, thank you, you'll get ticketed, even if you paid, because those lots aren't, those lots are set up very specifically for employees, and that's the way DU does it. So if you happen to be parked in one of those two lots, to avoid a $30 ticket, you'll need to use the P lot, which is the Newman Center parking garage. The visitor lot right here is okay. It was just full by the time some people got here. That is not.
You need to know. Person. And so I need to put it in.
Right. So if you go just one block south on University, it's that big parking garage. I would do it now because they come along and take it as opposed to wait until lunch. Yeah. Okay.
I gotta take it back.
Thank you so much. It means a lot.
I also give thanks to Nancy for not putting me on the camera for you to follow.
It means a lot to me from you.
It's amazing. I mean, go to that.
You help me turn all this stuff into a dissertation as well and stuff. Yeah, I'm trying to stay in New York City because yeah, they're great. So, yeah. What discipline? So my work is in trauma. So that's all time. Yeah. I didn't get to take your trauma. Probably one of the most
You're not talking about basketball.
interesting. So are you presenting her? No. My wife is. Okay. What is she doing? She's Old Testament. Yeah. With all those non-doctoral degrees. Yeah. It's fun. So you found that helpful or Side gig. Are you
Back in the 80s, the main and I do like yeah, I got to actually come give a talk at our at my university. So I'm trying not to do the total goose thing and carry on. I have the book in my purse because I read it. I don't care. It's like if I want to, but I know better. But it's like, oh, that's so. I had that too. Yeah, yeah. But I just keep every time I think about it, I just say, I'll pray for the Brite. Right there, you go.
Okay, friends, all good things must come to an end. So please get the good water, something to nourish you for another hour, and come back and take your seats. I'm looking for Michael. Joe, would you please find Michael? Okay, thanks. We're good. So while we're waiting for Michael to come back, let's talk for a little bit about how we'll use this time. Because remember, this is being recorded, so it is, you know, what we'd like to do is invite you to, you may want to make a statement, you may want to ask a question, and if those questions are to one of the three of us, then we'll stand and respond. We have to stand so that the recording camera captures us, and does that make sense? And we will complete this at 11:45 so that we can then have lunch together, and the workshops are at 1 o'clock. And you have a guide in your folders for where those workshops are. Does that make sense? And Joey Stewart is back there with a microphone, and he will, so what you'll need to do is, like, you know, raise your hand and indicate that you want to, you have a question or a comment to pose. That make that okay? All right. And I think then that we're ready to reconvene, and this is an opportunity really for us to further our learning together. And I realize that there are many people in this room who have real expertise to share on this topic and informed questions to ask. So, yeah, sorry, did I say 1 o'clock? Sorry, thank you. Sorry, fortunately I've just been corrected by one of my colleagues. I misspoke. The workshops are at 3:30. So 1 o'clock, we'll be back in here and enjoy the second plenary on sacred texts and moral injury. So for now, from 11:10 to 11:45, we get to talk with each other about the comments that we've been engaging in and learn from one another. So Joey is alert to hands being raised, and please go ahead. Naturally, all the way to the front. Yeah, you could. So you can be another mic person? All right. Here. So now we have two. It'll be good. No, please go ahead.
I'm Chaplain Lantigua, United States Air Force at the Academy, Air Force Academy. First of all, Michael, I wanted to say thank you for sharing your story, your perspective, your experience with us. So I have a slight statement, but I would like for the three of you actually to if you could speak to this. I think it's important as members of the military that we always revisit our intentions as to why we joined. And in establishing that intention and making it and having clarity about it, when we are deployed, when we are on the front lines, when we're engaged in combat situations or what have you, to revisit those intentions and continue to provide that clarification and the framework of the rules of engagement and the framework of the laws of armed conflict, and that whenever there may be a conflict as it relates to morality and ethics, to remember that we do have avenues of address when it comes to these issues, not only in terms of chaplaincy, but also JAG and chain of command and things of that nature. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in dealing with those who are returning from combat operations and they're dealing with moral injury, it is important to, I think, to ensure that they understand that these avenues exist, that you also, you have a right as a service member, if you ever feel that any orders that are given to you or any course of action that is directed upon you in the course of combat operations, you have the right to speak up and to question if you feel that there is something immoral and unethical, although legal, but immoral or unethical. Would you be able to speak to that, please?
Yeah, okay. So, oh, sorry. Stand up. All right. Yeah, there's a lot there, and thank you for sharing that. So when I deployed, for instance, I think it's always, I should always take care here. What I say about my own experience is not, everybody experiences these things in different ways, different chains of command. So my unit was small, and we were given a little laminated sort of thing on a key ring type deal with the rules of engagement and I would say a concise, maybe fifth grade reading level of the Geneva Convention, right, on this little.
On a keychain?
Well, not a keychain. It was like cards, laminated cards on a thing. And there's practical reason. I mean, you carry it in your cargo pocket. You're sweating all the time. Like, it makes sense. I'm not trying to belittle the intent there. What can I say, though? I mean, I didn't consult that a lot while I was there. Not because it wasn't important to me, but I'll put it this way. The way rules of engagement and the broader umbrella of the Geneva Convention and the even broader umbrella of just war theory was discussed or not discussed in my unit was kind of like, this is a box we must check in our getting ready to deploy. It was taken seriously in the way that, I mean, all the boxes that had to be checked were taken seriously to an extent, but it was one of many. And in my own experience, that was one that quickly just sort of faded into the background. Rules of engagement changed rapidly during my deployment based on which forward operating base I was on and based on what engagements with the enemy were happening in real time. So rules of engagement would rapidly shift from, say, I mean, mainly, the one that seemed pretty consistent to me is we were not to fire upon anyone unless we had been fired upon. And that was viewed by many people as kind of a crippling rule of engagement. As a scholar now, I look back at it as a rule that is a necessity when there is asymmetric warfare going on. what am I trying to say here other than I spend a lot of time now dealing with just war theory, ethics, and conventions and rules of engagement. I spent almost zero time on that while I was actually an enlisted soldier. And part of that rests on me, but to me that's a big part of the problem is that we didn't spend a lot of time on that. And it wasn't just about when you could fire on someone, right? And in some ways that was viewed, it was almost as if all these rules of engagement were just barriers to what we naturally wanted to do somehow, if that makes sense. It's like somehow, I'm not saying this is true, this is a perception I have, is like we all just wanted to fire on everybody. So the rules of engagement were like little checks put in place to like sort of bracket our natural response. Now, I didn't really feel that way. I didn't really want to fire on everybody. But rounds being fired is just one small slice of what an occupation is versus what a traditional war is. And Tyler Boudreau is a scholar who spends a lot of time on this. That really the word occupation helps us talk about these current wars in ways that just calling it a war, which I called it a war all throughout my talk, so I'm guilty of this, but really an occupation changes the nature of this in a way that's significant. And I've talked way long enough, so I'm going to let...
Okay, I want to respond for just a moment, and you may need to say something, you may need to clarify. Two things strike me as someone who hopes to be an effective caregiver. And they would have to do with, if we remember that the way Larry Graham suggested, we think about lament as a process of lamentation to sustain life, to help us recover meaning. It involved sharing anguish, interrogating causes, and reinvesting in hope. And it seems to me that what you're raising might have to do with interrogating causes. For me, the question I would be listening attentively to if I were accompanying a veteran would be whether that veteran were taking on guilt that didn't belong to them related to these points, given the kinds of things that Michael was just describing about the realities of occupation. And if one were ordered to, in an occupation when you've got folks throwing what could be grenades or rocks, or is that a vest, a suicide vest or not? I guess what I would really want to be with them to invite their reflection would be the extent to which that's guilt for which they need to confess, or whether it is the consequence of war or the context of occupation in which they have less responsibility. Does that make sense? That would be what I would be hoping I could help them deal with. And also, since you mentioned they could raise those later, is it really safe? Is that truly an option in terms of what the consequences might be for a veteran or a person who's continuing to be? What happens if you do that? So there's ambiguities in what you're lifting up that I think, for me as a caregiver, I would want to support them in exploring what may have prevented or what makes it difficult to imagine taking a step that looks on paper like they could do, but would be another injurious experience for them. Does that make sense? Is there more you want to ask or say? Okay. Then another question or comment. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, it just took me a second to think of what I actually wanted to say now that I'm rambled. So this article, Tyler Boudreau wrote an article called The Morally Injured. That's the thing I wanted to highlight. In it, he talks about the difference between an occupation and a war. And he's talking about moral injury. He was a Marine captain, and he describes people going into homes searching for weapons where nothing happens that's really, it doesn't break any rule of engagement. It doesn't, flip over the Geneva Convention, but there is a representation of power there. And he describes it as a Marine hugging a man in this home that they've just searched. And they were careful in the search of the home in this story he's telling. But this hug for Tyler represents this kind of power that the man is helpless. He's helpless to do anything but be hugged by this Marine, right? And we might think of that as kind of inconsequential, but for Tyler, that was, to him, that's the representation of this occupation, is that there are firefights, there are things that are clearer we could talk about, but then there's the minutia of the war that's just been going on for a decade of just being in people's homes, being this armed force as children have grown up and become adults. That is kind of deeper layer when we get to. All right, now.
You go. Okay, great. And then
All right. The remote nature of some of our multinational and multi-agency and multi-service operations have created a virtual air responsibility, which has lent itself to a deployed in place force who can be engaged internationally, domestically, and who can also be engaged internationally right where they live in that context. I'm wondering, has the research and the literature on moral injury reframed or redefined our idea of what a wounded warrior is and who that wounded warrior is? We're talking about contractors, government service, and uniformed individuals who are involved in this remote and virtual environment where they live.
I'm probably a little like Michael. I'm like a percolating thinker, so immediate response is hard. I do think the idea that our so drone warfare, the proximity, whether or not the proximity to war and what one has done, what marks are left by that. So I work kind of in metaphor and symbols, right? So what type of wound is it when you didn't do the actual physical act of wounding? But that some, this is Nancy Sherman's term, moral residue remains from the harm that you've done. And so what type of mark is that on your conscience? So you've got different kinds of markings, right? Whether, you know, that Michael's would be different than someone for whom their act or participation is the proximity, there's more distance. And there are now studies showing that those who are not close in proximity are bearing they're having symptoms of PTSD, whether or not a contractor or, so yes, I think there are different ways of people living with marks on their conscience, and that my sense is that the moral injury literature is going to expand to take that into account, that it's largely been talked about as acts perpetrated as in terms of a kind of physical combat. And I think the receptive moral injury, the marks of having harm done to you, in which Larry's, I think, terminology is, in which your moral horizon is diminished by something that has been done to you. This is connecting with Sharita's paper. So I think there's great ways to expand in terms of moral injury. What is all moral injury the same? So I don't know, but there is evidence, I think, that moral injury is talked about in ways from a spectrum from moral dissonance to moral conflict. I'm just parroting Larry. This is Larry, a good plug for Larry's book, Moral Dissonance to Moral Conflict to Moral Injury. That's a scale of things that we all live with moral dissonance. So I think the broader collective challenge is, how do we live as civilians aware that we're in continual occupation mode? Is there a kind of moral dissonance we live with? Then there are kind of active moral conflicts that many of us would engage in. Or so when does something go from moral dissonance to moral conflict to moral injury? All that to say, I think the moral injury literatures are growing. Do you want to?
I'm going to, sir, would you pass your mic over to Dr. Brock for just a moment, and then we'll come back to your question. And I
actually have directly talked to chaplains who work at drone sites and special ops. So, and I've forgotten his name now, but the head of the chaplains for all the special ops forces talks about this issue. And there are two things. One is, I was at a chaplain's retreat in Montreat with the Presbyterian chaplains a few years ago, and I had a guy come to me privately because he's a chaplain in Las Vegas at a drone center, and he said, it's not like you think. It's not like a video game you're watching. You're watching a high resolution screen, and you may be watching your target for days before you get a kill order. And like snipers, drone pilots often bond with their target because you can't get the kill if you don't know it's the target's body movements and habits. And so they actually know their subjects better than ground troops. They know them like snipers. And he said he was in a room with 4 guys who got a kill order. And they've been watching that target for 2 days. And at dinner, all 4 of them individually came to him and had to talk about how awful they felt. So I suspect that they do the kill. It's not indirect at all. They do the killing, and they have to see the kill, or they have to go back in there and try again. Eye in the Sky, this chaplain said, is pretty accurate in the way it depicts what happens in a drone kill. But the other piece of this, which is the indirect thing that Shelley, that you're talking about, is he said they're using really young troops who are really adept at internet and connectivity stuff to do things like they do forensic research by looking at a beheading that ISIS might put online to recruit from. They have to spend 8 hours a day watching this horrible act over and over, frame by frame, to try to figure out geographically where they might be, or what kind of knife was used and what manufacturer made it and how did it get there. So they're not just watching this horrible act, but they're actually deconstructing it frame by frame by frame, and it wrecks them. Right. It just wrecks them.
Right. I'm going to speak briefly to your point for just a moment, and then I know we have another question at that table. But what I would say is that I know there's literature, for example, emerging in nursing, and so I do think that part of what you lift up for spiritual caregivers is the importance of paying attention to who is in your where you're working. Certainly what Dr. Brock has just mentioned is very important. I'm thinking about those of you who may be in congregations or other locations where there might be nurses, there might be doctors, there may be service contractors who come back, who on site saw things that stay with them. So it's widening the scope of our imaginations for who is affected and how they're dealing with it, whatever the intensity of that continuum might be. So a part of what I really appreciate about your question is this, and is what you've raised. And for nurses, for example, and for medical folks, for folks that work in the morgues, this is daily. This is seeing shattered bodies. This is seeing civilians whose bodies are shattered, and children, women, men. So it's a wider scope, this devastation of this occupation, and the realities of moral injuries. And I appreciate your question.
Thank you each for your words today. So I'm Jake Farnsworth. I'm a PTSD and substitute psychologist at the Denver VA Medical Center. Recently moved out to Aurora. And I lead a group for treating moral injury, and I also attend a religious congregation every week on my own. And so my question, which I think each of you touched on to some extent, is how secular providers and religious communities and care providers can work together, and maybe what some of the barriers there are that we need to address to do this better to help those struggling with moral injury. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Briefly.
Yeah, no, 'cause I'm following you.
Yeah, just briefly. Well, one, I'll say that it always depends on the religious community. I think how much, and the secular treatment, how much they're willing to cooperate. But I do think there's room. So I think of the clinical side of moral injury as these two trajectories, mainly of Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz as a group of Bill Nash and these others. In their initial article in 2009, and then in this recent book, 2015 or 16, the Adaptive Disclosure, they kind of, Jonathan Shea actually does this too in his first book. They kind of bracket this space where they say one might need a spiritual mentor or spiritual guide or I'm paraphrasing. Jonathan Shea briefly talks about the book of Job and some things in his book. They kind of bracket it as psychiatrists and psychologists as like, this is something that needs to be included in these treatment models. And I think they're sort of asking / leaving it to other people to come into that space. And I think some people in those clinical communities are more open to that and more, and that's, yeah, I'll let Dr. Ramsey. Yeah, so.
Just a terrific question. And part of what it strikes for me as the director now is the continuing work we try to do about research and how can we enhance this? How can we help these conversations happen? I do think that, as Michael suggests, it's partly what communities, who in those communities. Ideally, on my part, if I were walking with someone, I would refer when what I heard required an expertise of someone like you. Similarly, ideally, someone like you might overhear how part of the pain is directly related to that person's religious identity, and that you'd have a list of referral opportunities. And ideally, you and your colleagues and some of the folks on that referral list would have conversations together. That's the ideal situation. So part of conferences like this, is to help us identify each other and go forward. For example, I'm trying to identify folks in the hospice program, who've developed some resources, and I really don't know with whom they consulted. But I'd really like for us to have conversations that would enrich the resources that are sensitive to an interreligious frame. That would be important, and that would be a helpful conversation to have, if that makes sense to you. And also to have conversations like with medical schools. At the moment, I know of none. We're hoping to be able to do that because there's a number of medical schools around Brite. And could we sponsor some conversation? Similarly, there's like 4 doctoral granting nursing programs. But these are conversations that, to my mind, as far as I know, if they've happened, they're certainly in their infancy. And these are folks that come in contact and themselves return wounded. So part of the urgency for us at the center, frankly, is to encourage these conversations and to sensitize each other when referrals are necessary. Does that make sense? So I really appreciate your question. There's time for some more questions or conversation. Looks like we'll go in the back, all right?
And I am the chaplain for the Northern New England affiliate and psychologist there.
And so my question is kind of on the terms of the last one. We'll be convening a seminar on moral injury in Maine in a few weeks. And I've heard about, it's been wonderful to hear about moral injury, and it's very helpful. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the soul repair piece. You know, I heard about the theology of witness and our VA healing circles. Are there more concrete, tangible things that we can do? I'm particularly thinking of the performing arts and the writing arts, and are there pieces that we can be looking at to include as far as a way of helping to facilitate healing? And so I'd like to hear a little bit more from anyone who has thoughts to share around how we can move more toward the conversation around healing and what can be done with that.
Let me make a quick response. Please have a seat. Thank you. Couple of things. First of all, a number of the folks that are doing workshops and I are Carrie Doring and I are co-editing a special issue of Pastoral Psychology, and that should be out in February. So that will be the first kind of collection of collected in one place articles on spiritual care. In that collection is an article that is written about witness poetry, which is very similar to laments, to the helpfulness of a lament. And that would be, I think, a very helpful resource, for example. And there's no, obviously, your point about dance or the creative performing arts, I agree with you that would be useful. I have not seen literature about that. But I do think that this witness poetry, that's the reason I stood up, Sean Fossen will have an article, and I think it's going to be online. It might be online now if you have access to Pastoral Psychology. It's not an open access journal. So you'd need to go to a site. We do hope after it's posted that we can then find a publisher and make it a book that's easily available. And there'll be the third book coming out of the conference or the center. But that's another line of research. I'm glad you mentioned it, that we can help to foster. Thank you. Others that want to respond. It looks like several hands, so I need all my microphone guys. Yes, please.
I don't know where I'm getting this, but there is this theater of war. I don't know much about that program. It is a program where veterans collaborating and performing ancient Greek plays that involve. It's very compelling. It kind of reminds me of Shay. Maybe you could say something.
Yeah. So it was actually a theater of war performance that turned me back to my sacred text to say, why don't my texts speak like this? So if I had more time, I would have said, theater of war, what they do is they bring together civilian and military audiences and perform these Greek plays, sections of the Greek play. And I think what art does, it's my call for poetics. It provides what is spoken in that setting through, say, Sophocles' Ajax, is an ancient warrior story that resonates in the present. So something of that experience of betrayal, hurt, grief, it's an ancient story, and when it's performed in the contemporary setting, it resonates. It calls something up of the story, of the human story in the present. And what I think art does is it provides enough distance that it's your story, but it's not your story. Right, that through a medium, you can, instead of saying, what's your war story, it's you hear something of that story through another story. And I think aesthetically, or let's call it the healing poetics, the fact that you hear it in another provides a kind of space in which I think great healing can happen. So to have another story in the room takes pressure away from having this direct, maybe clinical contact, like what happened in war, right? And I find this in the classroom too, is if you have something else and, talk about what's happening with this character in this story. Like, who is this guy? Like, what does he suffer from? What's happening to him? And that in the facilitated conversation, which is key, something of the different wound stories come into the classroom. But people don't have to directly name it. And I think that's important, that often the healing can happen without us directly knowing what's going on with people. So art gives you some indirect way, I think, of creating a healing container without people feeling the pressure to kind of share what happened to you, from issues of war to sexual assault to so I think that was just building on, I think, well facilitated. It needs to be facilitated well, in which something of a collective story, not to diminish the particularity of suffering, but that something of a collective sense of wounding can be brought into a healing, potentially a healing process.
I wanted to add to the performative modalities that have already been mentioned, the creative use of faith-based or faith-originated ceremonies and rituals that can be done. In fact, there are several workshops that we'll talk about that this afternoon. And the idea that many faith traditions have perhaps ancient rituals or ceremonies that can be recontextualized and can be used in the service of healing from moral injury, not originally designed for that, of course, but with a little creativity can be very, very powerful. And I think that some of these rituals can cross faith traditions, that they may be rooted in one or originate in one, but they really can be adapted for others as well.
We have time for about one more question or response, or looks like two, and then we'll have to pause.
My name is Dick Ife. I'm from San Antonio. And I was on the comment about the intersection between what I call the church or the Christian community and the psychological and medical arts. Warren Kinghorn wrote an article called Combat Trauma and Moral Fragmentation that addresses that issue. And I found it in our church very helpful, to use the practice of ritual then to bridge that gap. He makes a point that in the medical and psychological arts, they can only go so far before they step into the area of philosophy or war ethics, and they have to stop there. And that's just about the point of where in my experience, that's the point where the wounded warrior wants to pick up the conversation right there. So I don't know if you've read that, but it was very instructive.
Hi, my name is Jean Jones, and I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I have a private practice in Reason County in Tennessee. And I have been aware that something was going on with the veterans for about 30 years that was not PTSD. So Reverend Brock came and she spoke to us, and it just opened a whole window. Because I am a marriage and family therapist, we look at a system, and I know today it seems like we're honing into interventions and strategies for the veterans. But as the veterans are having their issues, the families are falling apart. And so I have been really wanting to get something together on a systemic where the veteran would not necessarily be the sick one. The whole family is sick in interacting with the veteran. So that's something we probably need to keep in mind, because even the adult children, if they don't know what happened, and I'm finding out one of the important things for the veteran is to have the support of the family. That is very healing. And to have the support of the church. That is very healing. But the church don't know what's going on, and the family doesn't know what's going on. So one of the things that I have discovered is if the family somehow or another got information about what the veteran went through, because being Vietnam veteran, I've not found one that talked. And up on their death, we find out a lot of things. But I'm trying to bring it to the forefront that two of the most important things that's good for the veterans' healing is the family, their primary support, and the church.
Sorry, just a shout out to, I just wanted to shout out to Zach Moon's book, Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families. I think it's directly applicable.
Absolutely. I also know that in the last conference for AMFT, there was a workshop related to this. So it is something that's being acknowledged. I really appreciate the rich conversation that you've brought here after our presentations. I do want to underscore through the center and our interest in research that if you have ideas, if you have resources you want to make sure we know about, or you have questions, this is a part-time job for me, but if you will go to our site, you're able to send messages to me and just to help us. And one of the things that you will also find at our site, at the Brite website, is kind of an annotated bibliography, and we can widen that in terms of resources. So please let us be one of the points for dissemination and keep us informed about what you're doing, because it's going to take all of us and more to create an adequate, we'll always be running to catch up, but to create an adequate response. So I'm very grateful to you for hanging with us this morning. And we've come now to the point for taking a transition, letting you nourish your bodies again for lunch. And you can eat lunch in here if you want to. And then we'll begin at 1 o'clock promptly. So we've caught up, so to speak. And I really look forward also to that conversation then, where we'll be looking at moral injury in relation to sacred texts. So I hope that this has been an informative morning for you. It certainly has been for us. And we'll carry this forward now, beginning again at 1 o'clock and going through the afternoon. Thank you very much.